Again, so my name is J.M. Kirby. I'm the Advocacy Director at MADRE. And I just want to again thank everyone for coming and welcome you to my kitchen for this critical conversation about gender and racial persecution and conflict, and what it is that women on the front lines of conflict are doing to secure recognition for it. We're going to hear about what motivates the activists who have joined us as speakers. But I just wanted to emphasize, before I introduce our amazing guests, I just wanted to emphasize one of the many reasons that their work is important. The crimes that make up this type of persecution, gender persecution and gender persecution that's linked with racial justice, racial persecution, they are often overlooked in formal transitional justice processes. However, they leave lasting impacts on communities, on victims, and on entire societies. And the discriminatory motives that underlie these crimes, as well as the violence that characterizes them, can become normalized. And that can help to seed further conflict and violence. And sometimes they're a reflection of, or are exacerbated by, attitudes or paradigms that existed prior to conflict. So I feel very lucky to have three experts with us this morning, and I apologize that Madeleine Rees had a conflicting emergency, but we have three other fabulous experts who are going to help us parse what persecution is, what it looks like in practice, and what it is that women's organizations are doing to address it. We're joined by Yanar Mohammed, who is the president of the Organization of Women's Freedom in Iraq, a group that's doing critical life-saving work to address impacts of war and gender violence in Iraq. We're also joined by Charo Mina-Rojas, who is the national coordinator of advocacy and outreach with PCN in Colombia, or Proceso de Comunidades Negras, which is Black communities process. She's played a key role in ensuring Afro-descendant women's representation in Colombia's peace negotiation, and is on the special high-level body for ethnic peoples in Colombia, which is meant to monitor the peace accord implementation. And we're also joined by Lisa Davis, who is the associate law professor and co-director of the Human Rights and Gender Justice Clinic at CUNY. Lisa also serves as a legal advisor to MADRE. And so I just want to take 1 second to remind anyone that has just joined that we do have both closed captioning available at if you click the link at the bottom of the screen, and we also have interpretation in English and Spanish. And so you can click the globe link and choose your language, your preferred language. Hay interpretación en español e inglés para este evento. Por favor, haga clic en el globo al fondo de la pantalla. Ahí puede escoger entre inglés o español. To start, to help us kind of frame an understanding of gender violence, I wanted to ask you, Lisa Davis, about how gender persecution is understood under international criminal law, and how that particular charge could be used today.
Yes. Well, thanks, Kirby, and thanks for organizing this event and inviting us to come and speak at it. Gender persecution. Well, what is gender persecution? I mean, there's never been a successful case of gender persecution ever prosecuted, ever in the history of international criminal law, in the ICC, in tribunals, but it's been on the law books for some 20-odd years. So what is it, and why do we care about it? Well, gender persecution it's a two-part test. So you need a crime, and then you need that discrimination that happened based on someone's gender. So it's very similar to racial persecution or ethnic persecution or religious persecution, which have all been adjudicated by international tribunals. So why hasn't gender persecution been litigated by international tribunals? I mean, these are crimes that happen against women and they happen against LGBT people, but they go invisible. They go unaccounted for and unaddressed in conflicts everywhere around the world, even though they're happening everywhere around the world. And that's why it's an important topic for us to look at. So when we talk about gender persecution, of course, we're talking about sexual violence. That can be a form of gender persecution, especially when that sexual violence happened because of being set on discriminatory ideas about the victim and the victim's gender. But it's also about all of those crimes outside of sexual violence too. It's about torture, it's about murder, it's about forced displacement. These crimes can also be forms of gender persecution. They can be crimes that a perpetrator committed because of a person's gender, because somebody was a woman, because somebody was perceived as a queer person. And because they were perceived that way, they were treated differently. They were treated disproportionately, and they had these crimes committed against them by the perpetrator. So that's all very abstract and theoretical, but what do we mean in concrete terms? Well, Iraq and Colombia conflicts are great examples. Now, when the international community thinks about ISIS in Iraq, or it thinks about armed actors in Colombia, they don't see much in common. They see these as isolated conflicts happening in two different parts of the world that don't have much in common except that they're both conflicts and violence. They have a lot in common. They have a lot in common in terms of the way that minorities are treated and the way that women and LGBT people are treated. So if you look at the conflict in Iraq and ISIS, and I'm hoping Yanar will talk more about this as well, we see these crimes that ISIS committed, and they look like the kinds of crimes that amount to gender persecution. So for example, torturing a woman because she took her gloves off. If she was a medical doctor, needed to take her gloves off to perform medical duties. Murdering someone because they were perceived as gay. They might not have been gay, they may have been gay, but either way, they were perceived as gay and they were killed for it. Killing a woman because she served as a politician, when men who served as politicians weren't necessarily killed for the same reason, but killed because that was not a role deemed appropriate for women. That kind of murder or torture, the international community might collect it. They might see those crimes, but if they don't get the why it was committed, because she was a woman, because he was gay, they're only getting half the story. Now, shift to Colombia and you see similar stories. You see women that were regulated based on their dress. We see armed actors who tortured women because their dress was considered too short, or they weren't in the right kinds of clothes. People who were killed because of their sexual orientation. And then add a layer to both these conflicts. Add a layer based on racial persecution. Look at what happened with women in Iraq. I mean, we all know what happened with Yazidi, but we're not talking about other minorities too in Iraq. Turkmeni, Sunni, Shia, based on religion, based on ethnicity, based on race. There were certainly a lot of minorities that were affected that we need to capture this information. And then look at Iraq. Look at Colombia, similarly situated in terms of double discrimination. The majority of the conflict in Colombia happened on Afro-Colombian and indigenous lands. But when you look at the transitional justice process there, those crimes that are moving through that system do not proportionately reflect the types of crimes and the places those crimes were committed on Afro-Colombian indigenous lands. And what are we talking about? Well, for example, we're talking about the racial and gender narratives that were imposed on Black women in Colombia by perpetrators who sought to oppress them. We're talking about the sexual violence, the torture, and the murder that happened to Black women because they were Black and because they were women. But we're not going to capture all of that. If we only see the torture and the murder, if we don't see why it happened, because she was out of dress compliance, because of a stereotype based on race or based on gender, based on these racist or misogynist values, if we don't see these crimes, why they were committed for these reasons, if we don't get the why, we're only getting half the story, and we're not working to truly unroot violence that causes conflict. Because violence that causes conflict, whether it's in Iraq or Colombia, or it's because of a hurricane in the United States, or because of refoulement that happens in Europe, wherever it happens in the world, and everywhere in the world is susceptible. It doesn't just apply to conflict. If we don't get that why it happened, we're not unrooting the violence, because violence happens because of misogyny and because of racism. And we have to acknowledge those components, or we're never going to really work to end it. So thanks, Kirby.
Thank you for that explanation. I wanted to ask Yanar a couple questions. One is, I think our audience would be interested in hearing a little bit about what is happening in Iraq right now, and how women and gender nonconforming people or LGBT people might be impacted by that. And I know that as a component of that civil society groups are facing repression of different forms. And I'm just wondering if you can touch on that as well. And, the campaign of intimidation that OFI has faced because of its struggle for gender justice. That's like a multi-part question, but just to give people a little bit of a sense of what's happening.
Yeah, thanks, Kirby. I will address the issue from the other end, not from the a laws person, a legal person, or a lawyer, as much as the victim person. When you are a woman in Iraq, you are and you were caught in the middle of a compromising situation. The first thing that you get asked is, who is your husband, or who is your father, or who is your brother? As if you by yourself are not a full citizen. If you have a brother, father, or a husband who will speak on your behalf, then you are a respected individual, respected by other people in the society, respected even by the state. Because if you are on your own, you are not accounted for. You can be used and abused, and the law will not be looking at you the same it does to somebody else. Like, let me compare here. If a male and a female are caught in a compromising situation, and the male is, of course, he's a male. If he is from the right religion, which is, like, say, the Muslim religion, if he is from the right sect, like a Shia Muslim, if he is from the ruling class, he will not be accountable for anything. But the female, being first a female, and in a compromising situation where there will be no father, husband, or brother relevant to her, that's the first stage of being compromised. The second stage is, which religion are you from? Are you from the ruling religion or not? And if you are not, are you from the sect, the ruling sect or not, which is Shia Muslim? And if you are not, are you a Yazidi or a Black Iraqi? And of course, you're not from the ruling class, you're a woman in the first place. So the law and the state, the police and the society does not treat those two persons equally. Women who are on the bottom of this hierarchy are turned into victims by tens of women every day. So they are left in the streets with no protection, nowhere to go to. And the war in Iraq has left a huge population, female population, with no family to be protecting them. So the issue of bringing democracy to Iraq and having citizenship as a protection for individuals by a democratic state was all a joke that is not applicable to women. And I'm specifying here women, because women might be able to get the protection if they have part of a family, if they are from the right religion, sect, or the ruling class. But if you are an LGBT, you are hopeless. You will be used and abused over and over, and nobody will dare to protect you. We in Iraq, when I say we, I'm speaking here about the Organization of Women's Freedom in Iraq. We started out many years ago demanding equality. Then we saw on the ground thousands of women who did not have a roof on top of their heads, who had no protection when any male would allow himself to abuse them. So we decided to start shelters for women, and those shelters have been functioning for many years now. And in this past year, we found the mere fact that we are protecting women from being used, abused, and killed made us illegal in the eyes of the government. They put in a lawsuit against us, accusing us of course, being illegal, because law is a tool in the hands of these racist, these misogynist groups that are ruling. And we are speaking here about the same groups that were empowered after the war on Iraq. So when we protect women in our shelters, we are also accused of being outlaws. Going back to the original issue, a woman in Iraq who is alone, and we know that the war on Iraq left almost 500,000 women as widows and 500,000 as orphans with nowhere to go. So the hierarchy here is very clear. The state made it very clear to us. If you are a woman, you are accused most of the time. If you are a woman of the wrong religion, sect, or ethnicity, you are even more accused. If you are a Yazidi or a Black woman, you have absolutely no rights. And if you are LGBT, everybody has the right to abuse you. That's how it is in Iraq. We don't dare to say the word LGBT anywhere on social platforms in Iraq now. The intelligence is knocking our doors. Intelligence, police, and anti-crime and anti-terrorism forces are knocking our doors every day. And I will finish what I'm saying with this question. Yesterday, the intelligence of the Ministry of Defense knocked the door of our organization asking us for our founding statement. They want to verify how we are thinking, why we are doing what we are doing, and they have prepared 2-3 lawsuits for us in the courts. So discrimination against gender, multi-layered by religion, sect, ethnicity, is rampant in Iraq, and the state is turning into an Islamist militia groups who are walking on the streets, allowing themselves to hurt anybody who isn't within that category, that they that are the first-rate citizens in Iraq, which is male, Muslim, Shia, ruling class citizen. Those are the citizens. It's just like democracy in ancient Greece, where it was the democracy of the masters. And they have turned women, ethnicities, and LGBTs into the slaves. That's what they are trying to do. That's how we feel it on the ground as victimized groups and individuals.
Thank you for helping people understand what's actually happening right now in Iraq, Yanar. And I think it's really useful for people to grapple with this, this underlying background of discrimination that you're describing, which is discrimination based on gender as well as ethnicity and race and class, and how that comes back to re-victimize people who have already lost so much, women who have lost their families in the context of conflict, and also defines how they're experiencing conflict. I wanted to turn to Charo Mina-Rojas to ask about how, for a Colombian context, how are the crimes that are committed by armed actors in Colombia reflective of discrimination patterns in Colombia? And for people to be aware, there is an interpretation globe at the bottom of your screen. And so if you want to hear in English, you can click on that and hear in English. And if you want to hear in Spanish, then you can click on Spanish. Hay interpretación al fondo de la pantalla y puede escoger entre inglés y español.
Bueno, muchas gracias, Kirby. Muy buen día para todas y todos. Saludo muy especial, Yanar. Me agrada verla de nuevo. Un saludo de vida, alegría, esperanza y libertad desde los territorios negros afrodescendientes en Colombia. Yo quiero hacer un brevecito contexto frente a la pregunta. Porque es importante para comprender cómo voy a presentar la respuesta. Yo quiero resaltar y recordar que la población negra afrodescendiente en Colombia registra su presencia a partir del siglo XVI, como es parte de ese proceso de colonización y de trata transatlántica de personas de África, donde se instituyó un patrón de colonización y de relaciones de poder que da cuenta de esa aparición de la noción de raza, y lo pongo entre comillas, y de relaciones racializadas, de explotación, de dominación, de conflicto, a partir de las cuales esas personas de África y su diáspora, nosotras, fuimos y seguimos siendo codificadas, designadas y discriminadas como objetos dentro de un patrón de poder. Estoy hablando del racismo. Y entendiéndolo como ese sistema que articula esas desigualdades étnicas y raciales para nuestro caso, de negaciones a partir de las cuales se han definido jerarquías de inferioridad y superioridad, y una total deshumanización por la cual se naturaliza lo que nos ha ocurrido y lo que nos continúa ocurriendo. Entonces, para mí es importante esto porque ponerlo de relieve, porque los crímenes cometidos por grupos armados y que identificamos como persecución en lo que para nosotras ha sido una guerra, son una continuidad de esos patrones violentos históricos. Entonces, yo quiero referirme en términos de cómo esos patrones se reflejan a varios patrones que hemos ido identificando y como especificando. Uno es esa racialización, ese proceso de racializarnos, pero el otro también es un proceso similar que dentro del género nos subcategoriza, nos deshumaniza y que, bueno, ha estado nombrado como una especie de engenerización, como fundamentos de esos patrones de discriminación de los que se está preguntando. ¿Cómo se refleja? Por ejemplo, se ha reconocido que nosotros sufrimos de manera desproporcionada la guerra y los daños que ha generado. Esa desproporción se define en sí mismo como un fenómeno de discriminación que nos ha puesto al centro de las acciones de los actores armados, porque a partir de esa racialización y esa subcategorización del género, desde el proceso histórico de esclavización hasta hoy, nosotras, nuestros cuerpos, somos y seguimos siendo objeto de explotación, de reproducción, vistas como objeto para la reproducción, para el disfrute, que hoy justifica las violaciones sexuales, el trabajo doméstico forzado, el reclutamiento forzado, la tortura que se ejerce contra nuestros cuerpos y en nuestras vidas, los desmembramientos que se relatan en las acciones cometidas por los grupos armados, lo mismo que el despojo de nuestros espacios vitales, nuestras condiciones productivas, nuestras prácticas tradicionales, el despojo de nuestros seres queridos. Entonces, hay un patrón ligado a ese que es un patrón de terror, un patrón que por efectos de esa racialización, de esa subcategorización de género, utiliza la brutalización sobre nuestros cuerpos, el acoso, las masacres, la tortura, la desaparición de nuestros hijos, de nuestras hermanas y hermanos, de nuestros maridos, para generar suficiente terror que nos desmovilice, que nos desarticule, que nos despoje de toda posibilidad de agencia, ¿no? Lo que se llama empoderamiento. Esto es más agudo si somos lideresas y líderes defensoras de derechos, porque se conjugan esas dos formas entre el racismo y el patriarcado para ejercer un castigo sobre nuestra osadía, ¿no? De agenciarnos, pero también un castigo sobre los hombres que descuidan su trabajo en mantenernos en el lugar como esa subcategoría de género, en ese lugar de inferioridad. Hay un patrón de despojo que se concentra y discrimina sus acciones en razones de los lugares que habitamos, en razón de lo que somos y representamos cultural y políticamente como pueblo. Nosotras y el pueblo negro afrodescendiente somos el 30% de los más de 8 millones de personas forzadas al desplazamiento en Colombia, y la violencia, los desplazamientos, las masacres que se concentraron en nuestros territorios y contra nuestra gente, cuando se hizo ese reconocimiento de derechos colectivos en el 91 con el cambio constitucional, en zonas que son altamente ambiciadas por los intereses económicos, digamos que nos puso al centro nuestros territorios, la mayoría ubicada en esas áreas más productivas, más ricas de minerales, de biodiversidad, han sido ambiciados, y el pueblo negro y nosotras estamos en medio, ¿no? Defendiendo titulación colectiva, la protección del territorio, de la naturaleza, pero se nos identifica como opuestos al desarrollo, y por eso se aplican esas prácticas que son de terror para desmovilizarlos. Hay un patrón de criminalización, se nos señala y se nos acusa, de ser guerrilla, de ser paramilitares, de ser aliadas del gobierno, de estar contra el desarrollo. Nosotras sufrimos discriminación y criminalización por no acomodarnos a ese sistema de formas de producir, de formas de dominar, de formas de hacer, ¿no? Y entonces, porque no aceptamos la militarización de nuestros territorios. Hay un patrón que es la naturalización, que es una de las cosas que más nos causa daño, en razón de esa deshumanización que caracteriza el racismo, que caracteriza a esa forma del patriarcado, esa subcategorización dentro del género en la que estamos, desde donde se ejerce ese poder, dado que esa humanidad, ¿no?, en gente clasificada, codificada, no se reconoce, pues es apenas natural lo que se ejerza sobre nuestros cuerpos, sobre nuestros territorios, sobre nuestras posibilidades de vida. Por lo tanto, no es normal que seamos tratadas violentamente, se permite todas esas arbitrariedades, todas esas violaciones, toda esa brutalización, actos abominables y reconocidos como de lesa humanidad, porque no estamos en esa categoría de humanización, y es la manera como se nos discrimina. Entonces, además, esa naturalización es una estrategia institucional que nos despoja de derechos, que nos despoja y nos crea como una especie de indigencia política, de pauperización política, en la medida en que nos quita los derechos, y en lugar de permitirnos las políticas que demandamos, por las que tenemos derecho, entonces genera asistencialismo y dependencias que no nos permiten agenciarnos. Yo diría, pues, finalmente, que todas estas acciones de los grupos armados en el marco de patrones que he mencionado y que han terminado poniéndose al servicio de ese sistema discriminatorio, patriarcal, racista, capitalista, y es allí donde nosotras vemos esa relación y cómo se puede ejemplificar esa discriminación y esos procesos de persecución. Perdón si me demoré.
No, that was really, really helpful, Charo. I think that explanation is really important. And just for people who are maybe new to understanding the conflict in Colombia and all the dynamics, Afro-descendant communities with the leadership of Afro-descendant women have secured the rights to collective territory, though that struggle continues because there's a major pushback to recognition of those rights. And that's some of what Charo was referring to in terms of people being targeted for defending that collective territory. And together that, that combined with the centuries-long history of racism and misogyny and the way that it's directed at Afro-descendant women in particular, having an impact on how they have experienced the conflict. So I want us to talk to now that we've kind of helped to lay the foundation for people to understand both a little bit about what persecution is and how it actually manifests in Colombian and Iraqi contexts, at least. I'm going to have us start to talk about what organizations are doing to address it. But I did want to, there was one question that I did want to just, I think I left out in my series of questions to Yanar, which was, I just wondered if you could take 1 minute to help us understand the way that gender persecution crimes committed by armed actors, whether they're ISIL or other armed actors, how they relate to those existing discrimination patterns in Iraq.
Thanks, Kirby. I did fail to mention it while I was talking, that the way the political system was set up in Iraq based upon the religious identity turned Iraq into two halves, one working against the other. The Shia state that is ruling and treating the Sunni population as second-rate population, which gave the way to the creation of ISIL. And when the state is sort of a medieval mentality and there is a resistance created against it, it was even more brutal than the state. So the way ISIS had treated women during their conquest in Western Iraq for 3 years or a little bit more was devastating for the female population in that side of the country. Women who faced daily serial rapes and had babies as a consequence of that, they are still living like outlaws. They are threatened by their tribes. They are abandoned by their families or by their husbands who don't want to see them anymore. And the state does not address it because this is a woman who is, again, not the property or the ownership of a family or a male citizen who is defending her. So the women, when they were raped by ISIL, the whole world was talking about them, but now they are a forgotten story. And they still exist, and they are living in the most devastating conditions. So we in AUFI are sitting together with these women and listening to their sufferings now, not sufferings 3 years ago. What they cannot do with their children right now. They have children who are suffering mental health. They are suffering mental health issues, and some of them have lost their limbs while trying to run away from ISIL. And many of them need shelters when the state is not even speaking to them. So we had started groups of sitting down with them, listening to their agonies and addressing them in the ways that we can, being civil society institutions. And we want to plan for community hearings in order to bring lawyers and judges and make them listen to the suffering of these women. This gender persecution cannot continue. The government has to address their sufferings as prisoners of war. They were tortured. It was sexual torture. It has to be addressed. So we are planning for something that we call community hearings, and we want to bring the international community to it and make the Iraqi government listen to it and address it. Of course, we are doing this while being persecuted ourselves as a women's organization who is being taken to court continuously and intimidated by raids continuously. But you know what, Kirby, women will not be silent anymore. We have been silent for the length of history. Now is the time to talk, and there is nothing that they can do to keep us silent. Not lawsuits, not raids, not touching our reputation. Personally, we will continue to do this, and we need the international community to be with the women who were abused by ISIL now, not only talk about them when they were raped. This is the time to act on it. And before I go, I know that the MADRE organization has been very supportive of the women of Iraq, and I really commend that they give attention to this matter, because I wouldn't say thousands, tens of thousands of women in Western Iraq need the support and the attention at this point. So please help us on it.
Well, thank you for that, and for talking about the so what OFI has, the type of strategy that you're leading in Iraq to address gender violence and gender persecution, that I think is really revolutionary, as so much of what OFI has done, I think, has been profoundly revolutionary and inspiring for women around the globe. So I wanted to go back to you, Lisa, Lisa Davis, and ask you about how you think that civil society-led transitional justice efforts contribute to an enhanced understanding of gender and racial persecution by official transitional justice bodies, or in the broader international context, and with people that are paying attention to international criminal law. What kind of impact can the type of efforts that Yanar was describing, these like civil society-led women civil society-led efforts to call attention to gender and racial persecution, how can they influence official bodies?
Well, we know that it's women's groups and other grassroots groups on the ground who are on the front lines of addressing these issues. They're the ones that are reaching survivors. They're the ones that are documenting these cases. They're the ones that are able to cross war zones and dividing lines and checkpoints and be able to reach survivors that the international community would never be able to do on its own. So part of the solution, of course, is, capacitating through financial and other means these groups to be able to do the work that they do, and putting more emphasis on the community-based services and documentation that they provide, recognizing that they're the ones with the access. They're the ones that can reach the survivors. And then it's about using the work that they do in ways that can inform the international community in transitional justice processes. And I think that this has been a challenge for the international community. I mean, certainly we all know the importance of funding and supporting community-based organizations. I mean, we've been saying that for decades. But I think the question of how we support grassroots groups in their documentation, and how we use that documentation and that identification of survivors, that's been a little bit more challenging for the international community. But the good news is we have Security Council Resolution 2467 that just came out in the recent years. and provides language for this participation of survivors. It literally provides a survivor-centered approach, and it provides that approach to survivors of gender-based crimes. Now, when you think about this within the Women, Peace, and Security docket, we also know that the big challenge in the Women, Peace, and Security docket for decades, over 20 years, has been the inclusion of women in transitional justice and other peace or reconciliation processes. So we have oodles of international law and resolutions that support women's inclusion. We have studies, we have statistics that you will get to sustainable peace with women's inclusion. Women's civil society participation is really what I'm referring to. And besides this scores of evidence and analysis and law that we have, we still don't see their inclusion, civil society participation by women, in transitional justice and other reconstruction processes. Why? Well, when mediators go to, form peace agreements or get warring parties to the table, they don't prioritize women being there because, warring parties don't want civil society members there. It adds requirements. It makes things more complicated. It takes away from their power and carving up of a country the way that suits them better. So mediators don't prioritize it because they think we have to get to a ceasefire, and they're not thinking long-term. That, and of course, it's coupled with the elephant in the room, which is the patronizing attitude that the international community often takes towards women in terms of their capacity and capability to do this kind of work. But, we know that peace is more sustainable because UN Women and other institutions that have done these studies have proven it, but still remains a problem. So how do we get past this hump? Because clearly more studies and more analysis is not going to do it. More international law or resolutions is not going to do it. We have all of that stuff already. Well, the way around it is UN Security Council Resolution 2467, which says take this broader survivor-centered approach, and it uses the language around recognizing survivors of gender-based crimes. Who are those survivors? They're survivors of gender persecution and racial and ethnic persecution. That's who they are. And this includes women. It includes women in a way that they've been shut out, but then it also includes so much more because it's giving us a more disaggregated look at who survivors are and the perspectives that need to be there. And this 2467 gives us that survivor-centered approach that says, don't just include women, also include LGBT people because they've never been at the table. And then it's also don't just include women, it's include women with ethnic or racial perspectives who have also been identified as survivors of the conflict. So a survivor-centered approach based on how you identify survivors. And if you're identifying survivors to include women of ethnic or racial communities that have been disproportionately impacted by the conflict, if you include them, then it's not just getting women to the table. It's getting women's civil society members to the table who can represent those who have been most impacted by the conflict. And we have never had that. I mean, we see a little bit of that in Colombia's peace process with what they, with the both in the successes and challenges to their final peace accord that was developed, but its implementation doesn't reflect it. And the transitional justice process is also, I think, struggling to get there with this as well. And then in Iraq, we see none of this because we know that, we don't even get acknowledgement of gender-based or sexual violence crimes in terms of accountability in the domestic process. And there is no international process right now. It's mostly domestic in Iraq or domestic in other jurisdictions like in Europe, where they're also prosecuting ISIS fighters and also not taking into account SGBV crimes or participation of survivors of gender and racial ethnic persecution. So this is a way that we can move forward with that analysis in a way to get survivors to the table. Survivors of persecution, especially at the intersection of gender, race, and ethnicity. It captures a broader group of survivors. It captures women and LGBT. It gives us a more nuanced approach to which women should be in that participation, making sure we're reflecting women of oppressed communities, communities that were most impacted by the conflict. And where do we find these survivors? We find them from the grassroots groups and the community-based organizations who are doing this work on the ground, because they're the ones that truly have access. So documentation, supporting CBOs, supporting that grassroots group work, and then making sure we're taking 24/67 to include those survivors at the table in the larger processes. I hope that answers the question.
I think it does. And just so people know, we will have time at the end of this for some questions in the chat box. And yeah, thank you for that really in-depth explanation. And I didn't want to miss this opportunity to go back to Charo Mina-Rojas and ask you, Charo, about the strategies that Afro-descendant women's organizations in Colombia are using to unveil racism and misogyny underlying conflict-related crimes against Afro-descendant communities, particularly gender-based crimes.
Gracias, Kirby. Bueno, nosotras tenemos un reto grande para mostrar estas conexiones entre la guerra, el racismo y todas estas acciones de violencia basada en género, porque para empezar en Colombia no hay un reconocimiento real del racismo, lo cual hace muy complejo, no imposible hablar de persecución. Y por otra parte no hay una aceptación real de nuestra existencia como pueblo. Entonces, nuestra tarea es develar y buscar en el marco de las pretensiones de esta justicia transicional a partir del acuerdo de paz, que se reconozca que el racismo y esa engenerización, que es esa subvaloración desde el género, han tenido una continuidad y han permeado, han definido, influenciado las acciones de la guerra y los grupos que las representan contra nuestros cuerpos, nuestros territorios y nuestro proyecto de vida como individual y como pueblo. Entonces, pues nos hemos dedicado por una parte a documentar y recoger elementos que ayuden a ejemplificar y por otra parte a generar análisis críticos sobre esas razones de la guerra, sus impactos, los daños en nuestras vidas, presentando argumentos que conecten esa continuidad de violencias del racismo, de la misoginia, con el continuo de violencias que vivimos hoy, para exponer esas raíces y para ligarla y comprenderla desde esos intereses económicos, pongo entre comillas legales, porque son violentadores de nuestros derechos, ¿no? Y muy inconstitucionales, pero también esos intereses económicos y legales que se mueven aquí. Así que hemos venido documentando, formulando informes, llevamos 3 informes presentados con esos argumentos y análisis crítico para mirar esa violencia que nos daña de manera estructural como una forma de persecución por lo que representamos como mujeres y como negras afrodescendientes. Nosotras entendemos que somos un peligro para ese sistema de poderes y tratamos de explicar esos por qué. Varias organizaciones de mujeres se han presentado informes a la Comisión para el Esclarecimiento de la Verdad y están presentándose informes a la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz. Desde el PCN y la organización que yo hago parte, estamos preparando un informe para la Jurisdicción Especial para la Paz, precisamente que abra, digamos, una oportunidad de tener un macrocaso que identifique como responsabilidad la participación, digamos que identifique la responsabilidad de los grupos armados en una estrategia genocida de persecución por raza, por género, en el sistema de poderes del cual el Estado es regente y responsable. Pero también estamos preparando un informe con MADRE precisamente sobre persecución con base en todo lo que hemos expuesto anteriormente y Ya hemos contribuido desde el Consejo Nacional de Paz Afrocolombiano con un informe a la Comisión de la Verdad sobre Racismo y Guerra, con un capítulo de violencia basada en género, precisamente ahondando en estos temas. Para nosotras hay prácticas racistas que pareciera que están desligadas de la guerra y que sin embargo hacen parte de ese estado de cosas estructurales y estructurantes, de las condiciones que han hecho muy fácil para los actores de la guerra convertirnos en un blanco de sus acciones directas e indirectas, por no sentirse frente a seres con humanidad que merecen respeto, y por identificar como un acto no permisible, y yo creo que eso también sucede en Irán, como un acto no permisible en el proyecto de control e imposición de ese sistema de poderes patriarcales, racistas, capitalistas, nuestro ejercicio de agencia, es decir, de ejercer humanidad y politicidad. Y bueno, nosotras nos proponemos a demostrar que esos son actos de persecución.
I really appreciate that and the sharing of strategies. Before we move on to questions from the audience, I wanted to just ask about, for other people who want to employ this kind of strategy, if there are any particular challenges that they need to think about, or any benefits that they need to keep in mind. I'm just curious, for people that want to address gender and racial persecution in conflict in another context, is there any advice that you might offer from the work that you're doing right now? And that can go to really any of our panelists. And I'm also going to just encourage for panelists that would like to, attendees that would like to, please type questions in the chat box. We invite you to give us some questions for the panelists.
Yo podría empezar, aunque veo como a Yanar alistándose, pero yo podría decir, Kirby, nosotras, cuando se abrió la oportunidad con el acuerdo de paz de la Comisión de la Verdad y presentar casos a la Comisión de la Verdad, una de las grandes lecciones fue la documentación de casos, o sea, todo esto que narra, por ejemplo, Yanar, todas estas cosas que hemos vivido nosotras en Colombia necesitan ser documentadas, y hemos aprendido la necesidad de llevar un registro de todo lo que ocurre, porque al final del día, a pesar de que se manifieste toda una voluntad como para escuchar la verdad y esclarecerla y hacer reconocimiento, siempre está el reclamo de demuestre, ¿no? Que sí efectivamente sucedió, a pesar de que es tan obvio, ¿no? Y ahí es donde precisamente uno puede ver todos esos efectos de esos procesos discriminatorios, deshumanizantes. Entonces, una lección que nosotras tenemos y estamos tratando de superar es esa de documentar constantemente y de estar haciendo visible, de estar mostrando, informando a la misma sociedad colombiana, por ejemplo, que ignora qué pasa en nuestros territorios, qué nos pasa como mujeres, qué pasa contra nuestras niñas desaparecidas, violentadas, torturadas, dar esa información y ponerla allí enfrente. Digamos que hay un papel muy importante de la comunidad internacional y Yanar hacía un llamado fuertísimo frente a eso. Hay un papel muy importante porque nosotras hemos aprendido que los países generan sus relaciones entre gobiernos y tienen una serie de dependencias e interdependencias, y la comunidad internacional de derechos humanos, de defensa de derechos de las mujeres, juegan y pueden jugar un papel muy importante de llamar atención, de generar, de hacer incidencia y de, digamos, generar ciertas presiones sobre los estados para transformar cosas. Eso nos genera al mismo tiempo algunas condiciones, a veces mínimas, a veces enormes, de protección y de seguridad. Nosotras hemos aprendido que hacer visible lo que nos pasa también nos puede elevar un poco el perfil para crear ciertas condiciones de protección. Nos puede generar otros de mayor inseguridad, pero más seguramente nos ayuda por el hecho de ser tan visible a generar otras condiciones de seguridad. El silencio definitivamente mata. Y esa es una cosa que hemos aprendido pues con dolor, sufrida en carne propia. Entonces, hacer visible, o sea, hacer ruidoso todo lo que nos ocurre es uno de esos aprendizajes enormes que hemos tenido.
Thank you again for that, Charo. Lisa or Yanar, do you have anything you want to add?
Well, I wanted to thank Charo for bringing up this subject that in our countries, our governments are against us. They don't listen to us, and the more we speak, the more they act against us. So the role that the international community can play is huge in this case. Some people would ask me, how did our shelters in Iraq continue throughout 18 years after occupation and until now? I tell them we didn't do it by ourselves. We are part of an international women's movement who supported us and who led the international community to speak to our government and to force our existence in Iraq. So the old formulas that this women's organization is agent of the foreigners doesn't work anymore. There is a women's movement that supports each other and that empower us and help us to survive inside Iraq. So the role of the international community led by the pioneering women's organizations is hugely important. And the other things that I would step on like very briefly is that in Iraq, we are waiting for a legislation against family violence to pass by the parliament, but they are against it. And on the legislation side, we are unable to achieve anything. So what we do is that just like follow up with the issues that come up and try to get the support of the women's movement and possibly of the international community for it. It does help a lot.
I would just add that persecution, looking at persecution is while it's an old crime and it's been recognized for a couple of decades at least, it's a relatively new crime in terms of its jurisprudence and how we look at it. So there's some jurisprudence around, racial, ethnic or religious persecution, for example, but there's zero adjudication, zero jurisprudence around gender persecution. And that's because we don't see it. We just don't recognize it. So what, folks can do in other conflict or non-conflict situations is really look at how we frame those crimes that happen in country. Now, I know that at CUNY Law School, we're working on a handbook about how to identify gender persecution in conflict. And once that's ready, we can make that available to the public. And it should be ready in a few months. But the idea is that it's so hard to see, but you're looking for things like dress codes. Did the perpetrator say you had to wear a certain, clothing? Did men's pants need to be a certain length? Did women's skirts need to be a certain length? Were men not allowed to wear an earring? Did women have to wear a certain kind of headscarf or gloves? This kind of regulation is gendered, and that shows if the consequence was a deprivation of a fundamental right, such as, rape, torture, or murder, to say a few, forced displacement, if that was the consequence, if that was the punishment for being out of address compliance, then that may amount to gender persecution. Were women killed because they had a certain job that were deemed inappropriate for women? Were women put into sexual slavery, but it was only women, because there was a certain role assigned to women in that role. And then we want to look at those intersecting forms of racism too, in terms of the narratives around why it happened to a certain group of women. So if you look at, Afro-descended women in different conflict contexts, you start to see this double discrimination, this double narrative about stereotypes held about Black women that then fuel certain crimes or punishments held against them for deviating from certain behaviors that they were, assigned to them and oppressed on them. So these are the kinds of things that we're looking for in conflict that we really don't see. We don't capture in our documentation. So it doesn't take extra work. It's not extra documentation. It's just adding a lens to documentation that probably already exists. So people are out there documenting crimes in conflict. They need to be looking at this framing and looking for evidence that supports this framing or this ideology put out by perpetrators so that we can start to make these arguments. And if I can, I just want to say one other thing, which is this doesn't just apply to conflict. This persecution is historically known as a crime against humanity, and crimes against humanity happen outside of conflict too. So looking at the gendered policies that might also have the consequence of fundamental rights deprivations in other contexts are helpful. For example, in the United States, under the previous administration, Trump had a policy of separating families held in detention, immigrants who were arrested and held in detention, undocumented workers, undocumented families. And this separation of families, I would argue is a form of persecution based on race or gender, because of why they did it, because of the motivations, because of the racist and misogynist beliefs that the previous administration held. So we can start to use this analysis and apply it in times of non-conflict too, and start to see this framing wherever there is misogyny and racism. How is it being enacted or implemented through policy? What are the fundamental rights deprivations that are happening? And we can slowly start to build a case that these crimes are persecution. And the answer is, has to include then addressing the underlying racism and misogyny that fuel them. So I hope that helps.
Yeah, thank you, Lisa, and thank you to Yanar also for that response. And I'm just looking to see if there's any questions. I feel like usually at CSW, people are so eager to ask questions that we run out of time for them. And I'm hoping that Zoom is not making people shy. I don't know attendees at CSW historically to be shy. So if you have questions and you're holding them back, I definitely encourage you to type them into the chat box. And maybe I'll give you a second, give people a second to think for if there are any questions. And someone asked about recording being available, and we are recording, and I'm very much hoping that technology will cooperate and we can then make that recording available via the MADRE website and give a link to everyone. So please, come back to the website and hopefully we can have that available there. So we have a question from Jamie Tadger asking if there's anything going on at the international level that contributes to the lack of recognition of gender persecution. So what at the international level is happening that has made it so that there has not been this recognition?
Well, that's a great question. How much time do we have? Why don't we recognize gender-based violence at the international level? It's a good question. I mean, if we look at what gender-based persecution is and other forms of persecution is, it's persecution, based on these xenophobic or racist attitudes, right? So if we're not seeing it, there must be a little bit of buy-in to xenophobic or racist attitudes that happen not only at a local level, but also at the international level. You don't see the discrimination you take part in. That's part of the problem of discrimination. We don't see the unconscious bias that affects every single one of us. And we have to also acknowledge that there's work that we need to do on an individual level, on a local level, on an international level, to always make sure that we are challenging that bias and we are making sure that that bias is not prejudicing, is not blocking us from creating good policies or implementation of good policies, and that it's not blocking us to being able to see it when it's what's happening in the everyday experience of people's lives. So how do we do that? Well, we have to look at every time there's a fundamental rights deprivation, we have to do this analysis. We have to say, what was the intent behind the crime? And one thing that we've learned from international criminal tribunals is that intent can be many things. It doesn't have to just be one thing. So one mistake that could happen at the international level is that we look at a crime and we say, oh, well, the intent was this. The intent was to solicit a confession. That's why the torture happened. Or it was to, scare a community into submission. That's why the murder happened. But we have to dig deeper. We can't just say it was one intent. We have to look and see if there were other motivations behind that crime. Because under international criminal law, you can have more than one motivation for a crime. And if one of the motivations was also not just to scare the community into submission, but also because the perpetrator doesn't believe that LGBT people should exist, doesn't believe that women should have the same rights as men, they also believe that, and that's how they picked the person they targeted, that motivation is enough that could lead to it rising to the level of persecution. So part of the problem is when we look at motivation, we find one factor and then we stop. We need to look at all of the reasons why these crimes happen so that we're making sure we're doing a racist and misogynist analysis around motivation and capturing it when it's there and not just stopping at the first motivation that we see. So that's one thing that we could do at the international level that would help. And the other is just, reframing, how we approach conflict. It's just very typical of the international community to want to cut and paste how a law has been written 20 years ago into new laws being formed today, into new treaties being formed today. And that's a mistake, because that does not take in the evolution of customary international law or international criminal and human rights law. And we know that law is always evolving. We're always growing in terms of how we see rights and how those rights are violated and how we address those violations. And if we're going to do that, if we're going to continue to evolve, we can't cut and paste old language from old treaties without looking at how it's contemporary, how we can make it revised and contemporary to fit the deeper, broader, more complex analysis that we hold today based on what we have learned over the last 20 years. Otherwise, cutting and pasting language from 20 years ago says we haven't changed in 20 years. And I hope we have. I hope we have, because we have to do better than we used to do. And that's the only way we'll know for sure that we'll do even better 20 years from now.
Thanks for that response. And I see some great points that Charo is making. And I just wanted to ask Charo if you want to add, because these are some really good points. I could read them, but I feel like it'd be better to come from you.
Well, no, I was just commenting, but there is another question, so I would like to give a space to that. Just quickly, I think Lisa made two really good points in terms of that the intersectionality that needs to be used to read the situations and interpret and from the different factors that are involved, not just race, not just gender, but the whole, not just ethnicity or religious, but everything that, you know, come together, because they do come together, and also about the interpretation of the law. I mean, I think that we have evolved enough, our struggles as movements have brought enough to, and there are enough changes culturally, politically, socially, to see those laws in a different way, and make them more effective for the protection and the promotion of the rights. So those two comments I wanted to make.
Can I add a couple of things?
Please do, yes.
And I see Sarah's asking about what's the best way to go for progress on transitional justice in our countries. I would say that the past 5 years of feminist struggle in Iraq proved to us that this government is not willing for any reform. And they are still living, we are still living in the shadows of the Arab Spring, where they are very scared of like to turn over of politics altogether, ousting the government. So they have become totally brutal. They have killed already 800 demonstrators in Iraq, and women are part of those demonstrations. And we've reached to the point where we are desperate that this government can be any better. They only become worse and worse. For example, the prevailing political bloc has learned from Donald Trump how to storm into the green zone and how to claim the elections. And their leader says that if they don't win through the elections, it means that the elections are fraud and that they will claim it altogether. And recently they have learned also how to claim the Supreme Court in Iraq. A Supreme Court was created many years ago, but now they are replacing the judges that are in the Supreme Court by clerics. So our strategy as women's organizations is to demand seats on that Supreme Court for feminist judges and lawyers. So that's one way to go. And being part of the uprising is also something that we have been forced into, because reform with this government is not really working. So as a feminist women's organization on the ground, there's one way to go is to protect those vulnerable. The other way to go is to see what kind of politics can bring us any progress, and to just to keep all options open. That's how we think of it.
Thanks for that, Yanar. That, and I wanted to tell people that this event goes till 11:30, and we will be actually abruptly shut off at 11:40, just so people are aware. So if, you know, hopefully we'll end on time, but if we do go over, we will be cut off right at 11:40 from, you know, no choice of our own. And I did see a couple new questions. One was from Sarah asking about the fact that the ICC, asking if the ICC has indeed appointed a prosecutor for gender-based violence crimes, and whether or not the tribunal on the former Yugoslavia also had cases on the issue of gender persecution. And I'm wondering, Lisa, if that would be something you could touch on.
Okay. Well, we know there's like a new ICC prosecutor coming in June. And the Office of the Prosecutor does have an excellent policy paper looking at the issue of sexual and gender-based crimes and defining it appropriately as a social construct, and really looking at these constructs, which are these narratives that are imposed on people because of their gender, that restrict their rights, that create, and incentivize deprivation of rights. In terms of the former Yugoslavia, the former Yugoslavia and the tribunal and the Rwanda tribunals, they did not have gender persecution charges that were adjudicated. But we do see these pieces in the jurisprudence in both of these tribunals that help us understand what gender persecution might be. So for example, in Rwanda, we saw, the description of Tutsi women as femme fatales. This is how perpetrators who committed sexual and gender-based crimes against them identified them. And this language, this gender narrative that was imposed on them was a motivating factor in the gender crimes that they experienced. So we see this construction of what gender persecution might look like. And the same in Yugoslavia. We saw cases where women were raped in detention, and the court noting that that these crimes happened and were motivated by both their ethnicity and their gender, and we can kind of glean that from the court records, but there's no explicit successful charges of gender-based persecution that happened. In fact, it was only ever raised in one case under the ICC, and that case those charges were dismissed for other reasons. But what we do have is the Hassan case in the ICC. So the Hassan case does have gender persecution charges currently pending in that case. And if you look at the charges, the description of the charges, we do see, a very robust picture of what gender persecution might look like around the things that we talked about, the regulation of gender, the regulation of roles, the regulation of and restriction of, what women could do and how they had to dress and how they had to perform, and the fundamental rights deprivations, around that. So as that case moves through the court, that would be our first time seeing in an international tribunal how these charges might be defined or played out. And so that case is going to offer us much in terms of our learning and understanding of gender persecution as a crime. So that's one to keep an eye on. But certainly we don't want that to be the only one, because in almost every conflict, we see these types of crimes happening. So we also want redress and accountability for the crimes we talked about today, such as the ones committed by ISIS and, in Iraq and other places ISIS operates, as well as by the armed actors in Colombia. And we also don't want to lose that intersecting view based on race or ethnicity or religion or other reasons that persecution happens, that mix with gender oppression to create these double and triple forms of discrimination and violence that we see happen in communities.
Well, thank you. And Yanar, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, just one sentence. I see that the level of awareness of feminists around the world is progressing in such a speed, but the legal institution and the international human rights legal institutions are not following in the same rate. which leaves so many of us defenders of women out there in the cold with no, like, not enough protection for us. So this is a call for, please assist us, don't leave us on our own. And thank you, Kirby, and thank you, Lisa, for all that you do. Thank you, Madre, for all that you do for us.
Thank you so much. And that's actually, I think that that point about the need for the international and domestic legal systems to actually catch up with the feminist movement is such a great way to end this conversation. And I just wanted to thank all of our participants, Yanar Mohammed from Organization for Women's Freedom in Iraq, Charo Mina-Rojas from Black Communities Process or Proceso de Comunidades Negras in Colombia, and Lisa Davis, who is from the Human Rights and Gender Justice Clinic at CUNY and our legal advisor at MADRE as well. And thank you so much to everyone who said, people who were able to ask questions, and to all of you for attending. And we hope that you stay engaged in this conversation. Yeah, I think we'll end it there. Thank you again.